Havana is sinking deeper into economic collapse, and for millions of Cubans, survival has become a daily battle. Prices across the island are exploding. Food is disappearing from shelves. Electricity is becoming unreliable. Families who once struggled quietly are now openly admitting they cannot survive on what the government provides anymore. While the world focuses on conflicts in the Middle East and rising tensions involving Iran, another crisis is quietly unfolding just 90 miles from the United States. Cuba's communist system is facing what many experts believe could be its final breaking point. The country cannot afford enough food, it cannot afford enough oil, and the government that promised equality and security has proven incapable of providing even the most basic necessities to its own people. Cuban leaders continue blaming the United States for the country's suffering. President Miguel Diaz-Canel accuses America of aggression and economic warfare. Cuban officials describe U.S. sanctions as cruel punishment against ordinary citizens. But while speeches are being made and blame is being thrown around, ordinary Cubans are facing a reality that gets worse by the day. Gasoline prices have become absurdly high. Public transportation is overcrowded and unreliable. Long blackouts are common. Entire neighborhoods go dark for hours. The government continues insisting that outside forces are responsible, but many people are starting to ask a more uncomfortable question. If communism was supposed to create equality and prosperity, why has Cuba become so dependent on foreign aid just to survive?
For years, Cuba survived because other anti-American governments kept the system alive. Venezuela supplied massive amounts of heavily discounted oil. Cuba would even resell a large percentage of that oil for cash instead of using it to improve life for ordinary citizens. Iran helped refine Venezuelan oil into usable gasoline. Russia provided support whenever it could. But today, those support systems are collapsing. Venezuela is struggling with its own disasters. Iran is distracted by international conflict and sanctions. Russia is tied down elsewhere. And suddenly, Cuba is being forced to face a terrifying reality. Without outside rescue, the communist system on the island cannot sustain itself. This is where the debate over communism becomes impossible to ignore. Defenders of the Cuban government often argue that the system would have succeeded if not for outside pressure. They claim sanctions and American hostility prevented Cuba from becoming the prosperous socialist society it dreamed of becoming. But critics argue something entirely different. They say the failure was built into the system from the very beginning. A system that destroys private enterprise, punishes economic ambition, and centralizes all power into the hands of the state eventually runs out of other people's money. Cuba's crisis, they argue, is not an accident. It is the predictable result of an economic model that cannot generate prosperity on its own.
What makes Cuba especially fascinating is that it was supposed to be the perfect test case for communism. It is an island nation with limited escape routes and strict government control. In many other communist systems throughout history, leaders blamed economic failure on people leaving the country or outside interference. But Cuba maintained some of the strictest controls imaginable for decades. Redistribution was enforced aggressively. Private ownership was crushed. The government controlled nearly everything. Yet despite all of that control, the economy still collapsed into shortages, rationing, and dependency on foreign assistance. That reality has forced even some former supporters to question whether the problem was never the blockade, but the system itself. Instead of building an economy that encouraged innovation and productivity, the Cuban government spent decades suppressing dissent and imprisoning opposition voices. Political loyalty became more important than economic competence. Criticizing the government could lead to surveillance, harassment, or prison.
And while ordinary people waited in endless lines for bread and medicine, the political elite lived under entirely different conditions. The state maintained its power not by creating wealth, but by controlling access to what little wealth existed. This created a society where survival often depended more on political connections than hard work or talent. Cuba also became strategically useful for governments hostile to the United States. Even though the island lacked strong exports or industrial power, it offered something else: proximity to America. For countries like Russia, Venezuela, and Iran, Cuba served as a symbolic and political ally, sitting directly off the American coastline.
That relationship helped keep the Cuban government alive long after its economy stopped functioning properly. But now, the entire support network that sustained Havana for decades is weakening, and the consequences are becoming impossible to hide. The collapse of subsidized oil shipments has devastated daily life. Cuba cannot afford oil at global market prices. Without cheap fuel, electricity production suffers, transportation slows down, agriculture weakens further, factories stop functioning. Everything begins breaking apart at once. The island imports around 75% of its food, which means it desperately needs foreign currency to survive. But Cuba does not produce enough competitive goods to earn the money necessary to sustain those imports. The result is an economy trapped in a downward spiral, where shortages create more shortages, and collapse feeds further collapse.
For ordinary families, this crisis is deeply personal. Parents who once managed to provide 3 meals a day are now struggling to provide 1. The ration book system, established during Fidel Castro's rule, was originally presented as proof that socialism guaranteed basic necessities for everyone. For decades, it became a symbol of the revolution itself. But today, the ration books contain less and less. Government stores that once provided subsidized food sit nearly empty. People wait in long lines hoping to find basic staples like rice, sugar, bread, or eggs. Many leave empty-handed. The harsh truth is that subsidies only work when there is actual production supporting them. A government cannot endlessly distribute what it does not create. In countries with thriving economies, grocery stores are filled because businesses compete to produce and sell goods. Farmers grow food because they profit from doing so. Truck drivers deliver products because industries function together. But in Cuba, the system weakened incentives to produce while increasing dependence on the state. Eventually, the government itself became unable to maintain the illusion. As conditions deteriorated, the United States announced offers of humanitarian aid, including food and medicine. American officials claimed the aid could immediately help suffering Cubans, but there was one condition. The aid would need to be distributed through independent organizations, like the Catholic Church, rather than directly through the Cuban government. U.S. officials argued that this was necessary to prevent corruption and ensure the supplies reached ordinary citizens instead of government elites. Cuban authorities rejected the arrangement almost immediately. That rejection sparked intense criticism. If the Cuban people are starving, critics asked, why refuse desperately needed food and medicine? Cuban officials insisted the conditions attached to the aid were unacceptable and violated national sovereignty. But others saw something more revealing. In a communist system, the state must remain the provider of everything. Allowing independent groups to distribute aid would weaken the government's authority and expose its inability to care for its own population. Accepting outside help without controlling it would force the regime to admit failure publicly.
This is one of the defining characteristics of authoritarian systems. Power becomes more important than solving the crisis itself. If citizens begin depending on churches, charities, or foreign organizations instead of the government, the regime loses legitimacy. The Cuban leadership understands that. To them, maintaining control matters more than admitting weakness. Even in the middle of economic collapse, preserving the image of state authority remains the priority. Meanwhile, ordinary Cubans increasingly rely on money sent by relatives living abroad. Remittances have become one of the largest survival mechanisms on the island. Millions depend on family members in the United States or elsewhere to send dollars every month so they can buy food and necessities. In many cases, Cubans receive more financial support from relatives overseas than they can earn through local employment. That alone reveals the scale of the dysfunction. An economic system supposedly designed to provide equality now survives largely because of capitalist economies abroad supporting its citizens financially.
This dependence creates a painful contradiction. The government criticizes capitalism while relying on capitalist countries and foreign currency to survive. It condemns American influence, while many Cuban families survive only because relatives in America send them money. The state continues defending the revolution rhetorically, but in practice, the system increasingly depends on external economic lifelines it once claimed to oppose. Supporters of communism often speak about equality, but critics point to the visible divide between Cuba's ruling class and ordinary citizens.
Government officials, diplomats, and party elites rarely experience the same shortages affecting the general population. They have access to resources, transportation, healthcare, and privileges unavailable to average Cubans. This gap between revolutionary promises and lived reality fuels growing frustration among the people. Equality, many argue, exists only in speeches.
Across Cuba, empty shelves have become normal. Toiletries are scarce. Medicine shortages are severe. Hospitals struggle with limited supplies. Blackouts interrupt daily life. Young people increasingly dream not of building a future in Cuba, but escaping it entirely. Many risk dangerous journeys through Latin America or across the ocean, searching for opportunities elsewhere. Ironically, Cubans often thrive once they leave the system behind. In cities across the United States and around the world, Cuban immigrants have built successful businesses and communities. Critics argue this proves the problem is not the Cuban people themselves, but the economic structure trapping them. American officials continue insisting that humanitarian aid is available immediately if the Cuban government allows independent distribution. They claim millions of dollars in aid remain untouched because Havana refuses the conditions attached to it. Cuban authorities reject these accusations and portray the offers as political manipulation designed to undermine national sovereignty. The standoff continues while ordinary people suffer in worsening conditions.
At the heart of this crisis is a brutal political reality. If the Cuban government allows outside organizations to provide relief directly to citizens, it risks losing control over the narrative. Citizens may begin asking why foreign charities can feed them, while their own government cannot. They may begin questioning whether the revolution truly serves them anymore. For authoritarian systems, those questions are dangerous. The shortages themselves are also not distributed equally. Electricity is rationed unevenly. Some neighborhoods receive power while others sit in darkness. Fuel distribution favors certain sectors and regions over others. Access often depends on political importance and state priorities rather than fairness. This reality directly contradicts the image of universal equality promoted for decades by communist ideology. Defenders of the Cuban government continue blaming the American embargo for everything. Yet critics point out that Cuba's biggest problem right now is not a blockade preventing aid or trade entirely. Cuba's problem is that it cannot afford global prices because its economy does not produce enough value. Even when oil prices were lower, the island still depended heavily on free or subsidized shipments from allies like Venezuela. Now that those allies are struggling themselves, the weakness of the Cuban system is fully exposed. The debate over capitalism versus communism has become central to the conversation. Critics argue that capitalism, despite its flaws, creates incentives for innovation, production, and growth. People can own businesses, invest, create wealth, and improve their standard of living. Under communism, however, the government attempts to centrally control economic life while suppressing private enterprise. Over time, critics say, this destroys productivity and creates dependency. When the state eventually runs out of resources, the entire system begins collapsing.
At the same time, some fear the growing instability in Cuba could eventually force major political change. American officials have hinted that they want a prosperous and stable Cuba, rather than a failed state sitting close to U.S. shores. But what would political transition actually look like? Who would lead the country if the current regime weakened or collapsed? Could Cuba transition toward a freer economic system while avoiding chaos? Those questions remain unanswered. One argument heard frequently is that Cubans succeed everywhere except Cuba itself. Cuban immigrants have built thriving businesses and communities across the world. Doctors, entrepreneurs, artists, and workers from Cuba often flourish once placed in freer economies. That observation has led many critics to conclude that the Cuban people are not the issue. The structure governing them is.
Yet, despite all the pressure, the Cuban leadership shows little willingness to change direction fundamentally. Officials continue doubling down on the same centralized economic model, even as conditions worsen. Critics compare this behavior to other authoritarian governments that refuse compromise, even when facing disaster. Maintaining power remains the ultimate priority. Reform threatens the ruling elite because meaningful reform could eventually weaken their control over society. The situation becomes even more complicated because geopolitical tensions continue distracting global attention. With conflicts involving Iran, Russia, and other major powers dominating headlines, Cuba's crisis risks becoming background noise internationally. But inside the country, the pressure continues building every single day. The shortages grow worse. The frustration deepens. The dependence on outside support becomes more obvious.
Reports also suggest that humanitarian goods entering Cuba are sometimes resold through state-linked businesses instead of freely distributed to citizens. Critics argue this turns aid itself into another tool of control and profit for those connected to the regime. If true, it explains why outside organizations insist on independent distribution channels before providing additional support. Cuban officials continue presenting resistance and sovereignty as symbols of national pride. Government representatives speak about resilience, independence, and refusing to surrender to foreign pressure. But for many ordinary Cubans, sitting in dark apartments with empty refrigerators, those speeches offer little comfort. Pride does not replace electricity. Political slogans do not fill grocery shelves.
The tragedy of Cuba is that the people themselves are trapped between political systems, global conflicts, and decades of economic mismanagement. The leadership fears losing control. Foreign governments pursue strategic interests. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens simply want stable electricity, affordable food, and the ability to build a future for themselves and their children. Whether Cuba reforms peacefully, collapses economically, or somehow stabilizes again remains uncertain. But one thing is clear. The crisis unfolding on the island is no longer something the world can easily ignore.